Harry, but adding more to the mix was beginning to tax both his patience and his energy. After each class, Harry, Hermione, and Ron had split up and disappeared. After the second time, Dumbledore placed tracking charms on each of them, but somehow the children had removed them. Asking them how they'd done so had resulted in blank looks. In frustration, the headmaster had finally sealed the main doors in an attempt to keep the hunt for them to a manageable level. It hadn't. He'd been at Hogwarts in one capacity or another for a number of years, and he was still surprised to find the number of rooms, closets, and alcoves he had never visited before. The trio, however, seemed to have no problem finding the most obscure places to hide from him. I think it was easier when they went outside, he murmured quietly. I never knew hide and seek could be so exhausting. Yawning, he stood up and made his way to his private quarters, too tired to think of a solution to his wayward student problem. 6 days later, every student, except the Slytherins, had refused to go to class. The staff had been appalled. The prefects had been threatened with the removal of their privileges. As a result, they had resigned. His threat to the student body about cancelling the Quidditch season had been met by indifference. When he told them that there would be no Hogsmeade weekends, they ignored him. Dumbledore was at a loss as to how to fix the problem. October 9th, Headmaster's office. Albus stared out his office window, trying to ignore the pacing, ranting man in front of him as he was beginning to repeat himself. "Listening to me, Dumbledore! This could be a disaster!" Hogwarts is known as a first-class school, but because you can't control your students, the school's reputation will suffer. You better hope the press doesn't find out about this, or by Merlin, I'll remove you as headmaster of this school!" the Minister for Magic bellowed. "Really, without the Board of Governors' approval." Tisk. "Bad form," Cornelius, stepping on their toes that way. "However, it would raise interesting questions, would it not?" "What are you talking about? You are aware of the slight problems we're currently experiencing with most of the student body, as is the board. If the press find out and you or the board remove me after the story has been printed, I would, of course, be duty-bound to tell the public that the Minster and the board were both aware of the problems, but had chosen to do nothing until the press caught wind of it. Slight problems was an understatement, and both men knew it. The fact that every student from Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Gryffindor houses had followed in the footsteps of the trio, who were quickly becoming the bane of Dumbledore's existence, was much more than a slight problem. Dumbledore's smile did not reach his eyes. "I imagine the public would call you and the board to account for that, don't you? After all, we are not that popular lately, Cornelius." Informing the board and Fudge about the problems at Hogwarts had not been something he'd wanted to do, but he'd had no choice. Looking back now, Dumbledore realized that it had actually been one of his better moves, as neither the board nor the minister had removed him from his position, and had, in fact, helped him to cover up the problems Hogwarts was experiencing. They were now party to it. They had little choice but to let Dumbledore try to solve the issue as quietly as possible. As the man began to stutter, Albus stood up, leaned over the desk, his eyes beginning to twinkle. "However, I think I may have an idea that will satisfy us both." Fudge's lips compressed tightly before he finally spat. "What idea?" "A magically binding contract between the two of us." "No one else will know. Explain, Dumbledore. I'm getting tired of your prattle. It goes something like this. I will take a 30-day leave of absence. While I'm gone, you will appoint whoever you want to replace me. If, at the end of 1 month, you've found someone who can do a better job of controlling the students than I have, I will publicly step down as headmaster of Hogwarts. Health reasons or some such, and your choice as headmaster can remain, if that is your wish. If things have not improved at the end of the month, however, you will agree to never interfere in Hogwarts matters again. As this will be a binding contract, if either of us breaks our oath, we will forfeit our magic." Fudge's eyes gleamed. Finally, a chance to get rid of the meddling old cook. "A wonderful idea, Dumbledore. What sort of timetable are we looking at?" Albus nearly laughed out loud as he saw the calculating look appear in Cornelius' eyes. "We will take the oath tonight. I will take my leave the day after tomorrow. This will give you time to choose your replacement and me to make an announcement to both the staff and the students." Nodding, Fudge sat down in front of Dumbledore's desk. "Then I believe we have a contract to work up." Later that evening, as Dumbledore lay in bed, he couldn't help but chuckle. Stepping down as headmaster was never going to happen. After all, Cornelius was as transparent as glass. Umbridge would be made headmistress in his absence, of that he had no doubt, and while the students may suffer a bit under her management, it wouldn't last long. The students had a special loathing for the toadish woman, and if nothing else, Potter would quickly take care of her. Dolores' use of the blood quill last year might just turn into a boon after all. And once he was back, Potter would see that he, Dumbledore, was really a much better choice. October 12th, Great Hall. Hermione gazed around the great hall from her seat at the Gryffindor table and shook her head. "Well, the school's still standing and no one's been tortured. I must say I'm surprised. I figured Umbridge would have at least written up a few dozen educational decrees by now." Ron looked up at the head table, his eyes narrowed in thought. "She's been too busy croaking and catching flies." That seems to have ended, however. Hermione and Harry both followed Ron's gaze and realized he was right. "I'd still like to know who cast that spell on her and why Madame Pomfrey couldn't remove it," Hermione murmured. Harry's eyes narrowed slightly. If his suspicions were true, he'd need to have a talk with a certain house elf. Or maybe a pair of house elves. Umbridge stood up at the head table and called for attention. "As you are all aware, I am now headmistress of this school," she said in a breathy voice. "As such, there will be no more rule-breaking. Any such activity will be severely punished. You will all go to class. You will all do your assignments. There will be no more disrespecting the staff. After breakfast, you will all go quietly to your classes, except Harry Potter. Mr. Potter, you will go directly to my office and wait until I arrive. Is that understood?" She smiled at the young man, expecting compliance. "Keep dreaming, Toady," Harry said as he stood up. "Alone. With you. Have a Dementor stashed in your office, do you? Or maybe another blood quill." He laughed and headed for the door. "The day I spend time alone with you is the day the moon falls to earth." Umbridge's smile turned into a snarl as she quickly drew her wand. The insolent boy would learn, even if it required pain to teach him. As one, the Ravenclaw, Hufflepuff, and Gryffindor students stood up and drew their wands on their new headmistress. "Looks like the Ministry will have to find a new replacement," Hermione called out. "This one didn't last long." No one laughed, and not a single student looked away from Umbridge until she slowly put her wand away. October 14th, Gryffindor Common Room. Harry smiled at Dobby as the elf placed breakfast on the table in front of him. He'd begun taking his meals in the common room after his exit from the Great Hall 2 mornings ago. It was easier to avoid Dolores that way. She didn't take defeat well and had tried on more than one occasion to stun him. Thanks to his training, reflexes, and 3/4 of the Hogwarts student population, she hadn't succeeded, though she did sport a nice variety of bruises from the attempt. The students were a rather grumpy lot when it came to Umbridge. 2 nights ago, the headmistress had tried to enter the Gryffindor common room, only to discover that the students were also creative and had trapped the door. By the time someone had thought to inform McGonagall, Dolores had found herself with a rather amazing pair of buck teeth. The broccoli sprouting from her ears had been rather gross, but Harry had been amused to see the huge boils covering the woman's face. She's also been trussed up like a turkey and unable to move, though why no one thought to silence the screeching harridan had been beyond him. McGonagall had managed to fix the damage and release the headmistress. It was then that the true hilarity had ensued. Someone had managed to reverse Umbridge's knees. Watching her attempt to walk had been a bright spot in his evening. The Hogwarts gossip said that Madame Pomfrey had been unable to fix her knees and that it had taken a trip to St. Mungo's to patch her up. Strangely, McGonagall seemed reluctant to enter the lion's den after that. Thanking Dobby and watching the elf disappear, he began to eat. The common room door opened a few minutes later, and Ron and Hermione entered, both grinning. When they joined him at the table, he asked them what the grins were for. "Oh, lots of things," Ron said, stretching his legs out under the table and leaning back on his chair. "It's a lovely day. Snape's still stuttering the letter P, though he's taken to spitting a lot more while he's at it, so we've all learned to duck a lot. The other professors are so angry with the student body that they've begun to hold Slytherin House up as an example of what we should be doing. And Umbridge!" He paused a moment and closed his eyes, savouring the news. "Umbridge hasn't been seen all morning. The patients seem to be in charge of the asylum. Oh, yes, it's a lovely day. I saw McGonagall standing in front of the Gryffindor hourglass last night. I think she was actually weeping," Hermione added, shaking her head in amusement. Yes, Slytherin will be winning the House Cup this year," Harry said. "Think there will be anyone left to care?" Hermione asked. The three looked at each other and began to laugh. When the common room door opened again, the trio smiled at Colin Creevey, who waved and ran up the stairs to the dorms. Pushing his empty plate away a few minutes later, Harry asked Hermione how the study groups were doing. She'd been right about one thing. As important as it was for Harry to make a stand, he didn't want the other students to suffer, especially the 5th and 7th years. Amazingly well, actually. We set up a study schedule and it seems to be working out. I thought we'd have some slackers, but everyone's more than willing to do the work. What I'd like to know is how you managed to get copies of the professor's course guides and test keys. Dobby, of course. After all, he knows this school better than any of us, Harry told her. Brilliant, Ron murmured. And he has cause enough to dislike Dumbledore. Yes, he does. Remind me to speak to both him and Creature. I think they've been going above and beyond my instructions to them when we left the summer house. Why not just call them both now and speak to them? Hermione asked, a bit confused that such an obvious solution hadn't occurred to him. What? And ruin their fun? He shrugged when she glared at him. Let them play, Hermione. They're not harming anyone. Or at least not anyone important. Before Hermione could argue the point, someone called Harry's name. Turning, they saw Colin rushing down the stairs, a few third years in tow. What's wrong? Harry asked. I can't find Dennis. He wasn't at breakfast, and his dorm mates, he said, waving to the students behind him, said that he didn't come to bed last night. They assumed he slept down here. We didn't really think anything of it, Jimmy Peaks, one of Dennis's friends, said as he stepped out from behind Colin. A lot of us have fallen asleep in the common room the last few days, what with McGonagall not checking on us like she used to. No one had the heart to tell him that his head of house was afraid of her lions. When was the last time anyone saw him? Ron asked, sitting up straight in his chair. I saw him in the Ravenclaw common room last night. It was their turn to host classes, Colin replied. But I left before he did. So did we, Jimmy said nervously. But he knows better than to come back here alone. Harry looked at Hermione. Did you see him there last night? Yes, but I don't remember him leaving. Ginny, Ron and I stayed behind to help straighten up a bit. Shoving away from the table, Harry stood up. Damn it! I'll be right back. Turning, he jogged up the stairs to his dorm room, Ron on his heels. Don't worry, Colin, Hermione said as she stood up. We'll find him. This isn't like him, Hermione, Colin said quietly as he looked at her. He knows better than to travel alone this year, not with Umbridge back. We always check in with each other at breakfast. A door slammed closed upstairs, and Harry and Ron came pelting back down to the common room. Colin, Jimmy, go to the Great Hall. Get Neville, Ginny, and Seamus, then go directly to the hospital wing and wait there. What's going on? Colin nearly shouted. Where's my brother? Move, Colin. I don't have time to explain now. The rest of you lot stay here, Harry ordered. Ron, Hermione, let's go. The five bolted from the common room and split once they reached the first floor. So, Harry, where are we going? Hermione asked as she ran beside his best friend. Dungeons. The Marauders map shows Dennis in the room down there, with Umbridge and Filch. Shit! Filch is always moaning about bringing back the good old days when he could torture students, Ron exclaimed. They didn't speak again until they reached the dungeons. Harry pulled out the map and muttered the words to activate it. There should be a door down this hall and to the left, he said quietly. Looking down, he pointed to the footprints in the dust on the floor. They walked quickly down the hall, ducking the occasional cobweb, and heard the murmur of voices. As they drew closer, the voices became clearer. Do be a good boy, Dennis. I'm not asking for much, came Umbridge's hated voice. Simply do as I ask, and this will all be over with. After all, Potter doesn't care about you. He hasn't even noticed you've gone missing. I think he's unconscious again, Filch rasped. This is getting us nowhere. The boy is much more cooperative when pain is involved. We'll use the whip again, I think, Argus. Of course, headmistress. The pleasure in Filch's voice nearly caused Harry to vomit. The whip again. Stuffing the map into his pocket, Harry drew his wand with the intention of blowing the door in. However, his anger caused him to use a bit more power than he'd intended, and the door was turned to dust. The blast knocked Filch and Umbridge off their feet. As the three students entered the room, Harry and Ron ducked to the right, while Hermione went left, all three crouching down. Seeing their targets on the ground, Hermione quickly summoned Umbridge's wand and the whip in Filch's hand, while Ron immobilized them. Seeing no other targets in the room, Harry rushed to Dennis, who was hanging from the ceiling by his wrist. The boy wore only his underwear and was covered in bloody whip marks. Both of his eyes were black and his bottom lip was split open. "Oh, God!" Hermione gasped as she reached Dennis. "Bloody bastards!" Ron growled as he marched toward Filch and Umbridge. Both were dazed and stared up at him uncomprehendingly. "Wait, Ron," Harry said quietly. "Dennis comes first." With a flick of his wand, he levitated Dennis while Hermione released the manacles around his wrist. He asked Hermione to take over the levitation spell, then told her and Ron to get Dennis to the infirmary. "No," Ron said, gritting his teeth and glaring down at Filch and Umbridge. "You're in the middle of Slytherin territory, and I'm not leaving you alone in this snake pit. Finish this so we can get Dennis the help he needs." "Finish what?" Hermione asked. Harry looked at her for a moment, then turned his eyes to the two people on the floor. "Remember what we were taught, Hermione," he said quietly. She followed his gaze, and her eyes narrowed. "Kill when you can," she murmured. When both boys glanced at her, she rolled her eyes. "Just do it and hurry up. And for God's sake, no more summoning organs or molesting trains." Nodding, Harry crouched down in front of Umbridge and began to slap her hard until her eyes focused on him. "Potter!" she snarled and began to struggle in her bonds. "Silence!" Harry commanded and watched as she flinched away from him. Turning to Filch, he repeated the process until the man was coherent. "I've been curious for some time, and now that I have the chance," Ron said as he leaned down to Umbridge. "I just have to know." Grabbing the sleeve of her fluffy sweater, he ripped it off her arm. "I knew I should have taken the bet the twins offered," he breathed as he started at the dark mark on her arm. "I'd have made a few galleons. You know, Argus," Harry said conversationally as he levitated the man and walked him towards the back of the room. "You're lucky she didn't kill you. Death Eaters aren't known for being kind to squibs. What do you think you're doing, Potter?" Filch growled. "Why, giving you what you seem to love so much," Harry replied as he stuck the man to the wall and fastened the manacles around his wrists and feet. Releasing the levitation charm and the ropes that bound him, he watched Filch grab the chains connected to the manacles, trying to take some of the weight off his shoulders. "You're always pining for the good old days when these dungeons were put to use." Turning away, he levitated Umbridge, placed her next to Filch, and repeated the process of securing her to the wall. "They make a happy-looking couple, don't they?" Ron asked. "Just lovely," Hermione said. "Harry, you need to hurry. We have to get Dennis to Madame Pomfrey." Harry called for Dobby. When the elf appeared, he bent down and spoke quietly to him for a few moments. Nodding, Dobby moved to the manacles hanging from the ceiling. He tried to stretch up high enough to reach them, then huffed in frustration. Harry came to his aid and lifted him up high enough. Cupping the manacles, his hand glowed blue for a moment. "Down, please," he told Harry. Once his feet were back on the floor, he turned to Filch and Umbridge and raised his hands. Both humans were engulfed in a sickly yellow aura that slowly faded away as the elf lowered his hands. "Harry Potter needs to step back," Dobby said. Taking several steps back, Harry smiled at his victims. "You wanted Hogwarts so much. I give her to you, Dolores. You and Filch will now become part of this school forever." Filch began to bellow in outrage and struggle in his bonds. Umbridge shook her head violently and began to scream. Dobby raised his hands and smiled. "Goodbye, eh, Toad Lady?" he chirped. Turning his palms inward, he slammed his hands together, and the room began to rumble. A blinding flash of light came from his hands, and those in the room had to turn away from the glare. When they looked back, Dobby had his hand raised once more. With a wave, 2 sets of manacles appeared on the wall. "Wait, where did they go?" Hermione asked. Dobby took 2 steps forward and patted the wall gently. "They're in here, Miss Hermione. They're now part of Hogwarts." Harry spun around and moved toward the door. "Dobby, you have your orders." "Ron, Hermione, let's get Dennis to Madame Pomfrey." "Yes, Harry Potter," the elf said as he picked up the whip from the floor and rushed to follow the four people from the room. When he reached the door, he waited until the humans had disappeared before turning back to inspect the room. It was a little smaller now, but only he recognized that fact after having been in the room for the first time a few minutes ago. Hogwarts house elves were only allowed in the Slytherin common room and Snape's quarters. All other portions of the dungeon were off limits. Repairing the door, he closed it and rushed down the hallway. Sensing no one about, he stepped out from the hallway, turned and erased the footprints from the dusty floor, and replaced the cobwebs in the hall. With a last look, he nodded to himself and disappeared. He appeared a moment later in Filch's office and set to work. Dragging a chair to the wall, Dobby climbed up on it and once again cupped his hands around the pair of manacles that hung there. This time, his palm glowed red. Climbing down, he put the chair back, then moved the desk into a corner. Flicking his hands, small blood splatters appeared on the wall and floor. Finally, he placed the whip on the desk and stepped back. Lifting one hand and concentrating carefully, he reached out and placed several magical auras in the room, then turned and faced the door. Putting his hand back toward his chest, he made a fist. Then, snapping his arm out, he opened his palm and muttered go. A veritable rainbow of light streaked towards the door and disappeared. Dropping his hand, he closed his eyes and reached out with his senses. Fear, pain, hatred, shock, horror. Angry man to Lady and the boy. Harry Potter, Miss Hermione, Ron Weasley. Good, good, he murmured. Opening his eyes, he looked around one more time, then waved his hand. The room was engulfed in bright white light. When it faded, the elf was gone. Hogwarts Infirmary. Ginny stood by the doors, not really sure what was going on, but she held her wand in her hand, hidden behind her leg. Neville, Seamus and Jimmy stood guard outside the doors, though she wasn't sure why. Colin paced the infirmary nervously as Madame Pomfrey glared at them both. When she heard Neville shout, she moved into the shadows away from the door and waited tensely. A moment later, the doors flew open with a bang. Harry, Hermione and Ron entered, Dennis Creevey bobbing gently behind them. They moved toward the bed, blocking Madame Pomfrey's view. "What on earth is going on?" Pomfrey snapped. "I don't know what's going on here, but Dennis!" Colin gasped as he rushed forward. "What happened to him?" Poppy gasped when she saw Dennis. Hermione had put him on the nearest bed and moved out of the way as the Mealy Witch and Colin rushed to his side. Drawing her wand, Poppy began casting spells, while Colin grabbed his brother's hand and wept. Summoning what she needed, she injected several potions into the unconscious boy on the bed. She asked Hermione to take Colin to the other side of the room and told Ron to inform Professor McGonagall. All but dragging the protesting boy away from his brother, Hermione tried to calm him as Poppy pulled the curtain around the bed and turned back to her patient. His shoulders had been dislocated and his clavicles were broken. Harry stopped Ron before he left the infirmary. "Remember what we discussed on the way here?" Nodding, the redhead left the infirmary at a jog. Motioning to Ginny, Harry walked out the doors to join Neville, Seamus and Jimmy. "What's going on, Harry? What the hell happened to Dennis?" Neville asked quietly. "Umbridge and Filch," Harry spat. "I'll explain the rest once McGonagall gets here, Neville. I asked Colin and Jimmy to bring the three of you here for two reasons. One, I wasn't sure what the hell we were running into and, more importantly, what might follow us back. Second, once the situation has been explained to McGonagall, I want you, Ginny and Seamus, to find the prefects and inform them of what's happened. No one is to walk the halls of Hogwarts alone. The younger students especially." Seeing the questions in her eyes, Harry held up a hand. "I know it's confusing, but you'll understand soon enough. What is the meaning of this?" Turning, Harry watched Professor McGonagall and Ron rushing toward him. "Mr. Weasley said something about Dennis Creevey being injured. Why are you all hanging around here?" "They're the only ones who can tell us what happened," Madame Pomfrey said from the doorway. "Come in, Professor. Dennis isn't in any danger, but his injuries are severe." McGonagall entered the infirmary, and Madame Pomfrey lead her behind the curtain surrounding Dennis' bed. Harry and the others joined Hermione and Colin. When Colin looked at him pleadingly, Harry placed a hand on his shoulder. "He'll be all right, Colin. Madame Pomfrey's the best, I should know. I've been under her care enough time." After several minutes, McGonagall and Poppy stepped out from behind the curtain and walked towards the students. "Madame Pomfrey informs me that Dennis has been hung by his wrists, beaten and whipped," the professor said angrily. "What happened?" "Exactly that," Harry growled. Colin couldn't find Dennis this morning, and after talking to his brother's dorm mates, he asked Ron, Hermione, and I to help him look for him. Before we left the common room, I asked Colin and Jimmy to find Neville. Seamus and Ginny explained that Dennis was missing and to go to infirmary and wait to see if he showed up there. Why the infirmary? McGonagall asked. Honestly, Minerva, this is Dennis we're talking about. The boy who, in his first year, fell out of the boat on his way to the castle. The same boy who, in his second year, nearly broke his neck falling down 2 flights of stairs because he was in a hurry. Or this year, when he nearly burned himself to a crisp in potions class. I get the point, Poppy. It was a logical assumption. Now continue, Mr. Potter. We looked in all the usual places Dennis was known to go. When we couldn't find him, we went to Mr. Filch's office, figuring he'd help us look. Why Filch? Minerva asked. That man knows this castle better than anyone, save a house elf, Ron told her. Nodding, she looked back at Harry. Continue. When we reached Filch's office, we could hear him and Umbridge talking about using a whip. He ran a shaking hand through his hair and looked at his head of house. I'm sorry, Professor, but I was scared and not thinking straight. I kicked the door in. Umbridge and Filch were standing off to the side of the office, and Filch had a whip in his hand. Hermione reached out and placed a hand on Colin's shoulder. Dennis was hanging from the wall. He'd been stripped and looked as though he'd been whipped and beaten, she said raggedly. He was unconscious. Umbridge drew her wand, Harry continued, and Hermione managed to summon it before she could cast anything on us. Filch dropped the whip and told us that the headmistress had ordered Dennis to be punished. Hermione cast a levitation charm on Dennis, but couldn't remove the manacles while holding the charm. Ron and I went to help her, and that's when they bolted. Bolted? McGonagall asked. Ran away, Ron said. Umbridge and Filch ran from the office. I turned around and tried to cast a Jellylegs jinx, but they'd already rounded the corner. He blinked several times, then his eyes widened. Oh, Merlin! I tried to cast a spell at a professor. He stared at McGonagall, horrified by what he'd done. Minerva reached out and patted him arm. Be easy, Mr. Weasley. If what you said is true, then you've broken no rules that I know of. In fact, you and your friends may very well have saved a life. Has Mr. Creevy's injuries been documented? McGonagall asked as she turned to Poppy. Of course! Then I will place a call to the Aurors, she said, turning away. What? Harry yelped. The Aurors! A crime has been committed, Mr. Potter, Minerva said, surprised by the young man's reaction. They must be informed of what Umbridge and Filch have done. But the Ministry backed her, Harry said, staring at his head of house. She sent Dementors after me. She tried to get me kicked out of school. They hauled me up before the Wizengamot for defending myself and nearly had me expelled and my wand snapped. For Merlin's sake, she used a blood quill on me, and they let her, you all did. Hermione summoned her wand, and Ron tried to cast a spell at her. The Aurors, though, calmly, Mr. Potter, Poppy said as she moved to his side. She looked at Minerva. I think it best if he stayed here, Minerva. In fact, I'm keeping Ron and Hermione, too. This has been distressing for all of them, and I'm placing them under medical care. I don't think that's wise, McGonagall began. My decision, Minerva. Make your call and leave the medical decisions to me, if you please. Very well, Poppy, but I'm sure the Aurors will wish to speak with you, at least. Turning to face the other students, she made a shooing motion toward the door. Everyone out! Colin, you may stay until Poppy tells you to leave. The rest of you out! Grumbling Neville, Seamus, Ginny, and Jimmy all left the infirmary, McGonagall following behind them. Once the door closed, Poppy told Colin to sit by his brother's side, then lead Harry, Hermione, and Ron to back of the infirmary and told them to get into bed. Ron shot Harry a dirty look. Hermione simply sighed and followed the healer's orders. Poppy disappeared into her office for a few minutes. When she returned, she carried 3 bottles in her hands. Starting with Hermione, she sat down and placed a bottle on the table. She spoke with the young woman for several minutes, then stood and moved to Ron's bed. When she finally arrived at Harry's bedside, she looked at him, sighed, and sat down. You and I have spent more time together than I like to think about, young man. As such, I think I'm well versed in the many moves of Harry Potter. I don't know what's going on here, but I know a snow job when I hear it. When Harry began to protest, she held up one hand. Stop. Save your excuses for the gullible, please, and credit me with some intelligence. I'll give you credit for an excellent performance, but your concern about the auras was a lie. You don't want them to interview you, and I have my suspicions as to why that is. However, I'm not asking for details." "You saved Dennis Creevy from that horrible woman." She reached out and ran a hand through his hair. "Not enough people have looked after you, have they?" "You always have," Harry said quietly, "and I'm not sure I've ever really thanked you for that. The one thing you've always been, Potter, is polite." "Of course you've thanked me," she said gruffly. When he smiled, she patted his shoulder, then pointed to the bottle she'd placed on the nightstand. "That's a calming draught. Drink it, or pour it into the potted plant near the bathroom. Either way, I can honestly tell the Aurores that you and your friends have been given the potion. Thank you, Madame Pomfrey." Standing, she reached down and drew the blanket over him, then patted his shoulder once more. Turning away, she walked to her office to finish her paperwork and prepare for the Aurore's arrival. Shaking her head, she could only think that the headmaster had made a serious mistake in pitting himself against Potter. She just hoped she didn't end up in the crosshairs. While it was true she'd always treated Harry when he was injured, she, too, had never attempted to prevent those injuries. Office of the Deputy Headmistress, afternoon. Minerva held her head in her hands as Shacklebolt gave his report to Madam Bones and Minister Fudge. "It's just as the students explained it to Professor McGonagall, ma'am," Shacklebolt told Amelia Bones. "There are traces of Dennis Creevy's blood on the manacles, the wall, and the whip. Dollingworth, the unspeakable, was able to pick up the emotional spoor in the room, and it's as one would expect. Fear, pain, shock. But I'm sure he'll give you his own report. The auras in the room are those of Dolores Umbridge, Argus Filch, Dennis Creevy, Hermione Granger, Harry Potter, and Ronald Weasley. The other auras in the room had decayed too much to be identified, which makes them more than 12 hours old." "Did you follow the auras?" Bones asked. "Yes, ma'am. Umbridge and Filch ran from the room, just as the students said. They went out through the main doors. All trace of their auras was lost at the edge of Hogwarts walls. Potter, Granger, Weasley, and Creevy's auras were traced to the doors of the infirmary. Have you taken Madame Pomfrey's report and gathered her documentation of Creevy's injuries?" Shacklebolt held up the folder in his hand. "It's all here, ma'am. She is asking that we not involve the children in the investigation, if at all possible. They're all currently under medical care for shock. She says that the trauma they've been through would be exacerbated by making them submit to memory retrieval, and strongly advises that we avoid such action, if at all possible. Are you sure those students are telling the truth?" "Potter has no reason to like Dolores, and has made preposterous claims in the past," Fudge said, nervously twisting his bowler hat between his fingers. "Between the evidence the Aurores have gathered and Dollingworth's report—" "Most definitely," Bones assured him. "I just cannot believe that she would do such a thing," Fudge protested. Standing, Bones looked down at him and shook her head. "With all due respect, Minister, you would do well to distance yourself from this case," Fudge asked, alarmed. "You made her headmistress in Dumbledore's absence," Minerva said, looking up at him. "Exactly," Bones agreed. "She is now a wanted criminal. She had a student whipped and beaten, then ran when she was caught. If the press find out that you are trying to defend her—" Her voice trailed off, and she cocked an eyebrow meaningfully. Fudge blanched. "I understand." Standing, he faced Madam Bones and straightened his shoulders. "If there is anything you need from me, please let me know." Turning to Minerva, he smiled. "I'll be sending you a new headmaster soon, Professor. I have someone in mind already, and I can assure you he will do a much better job than Madame Umbridge." Minerva's mouth dropped open as the minister spun on his heel and left her office. "He's going to—" "After Umbridge, he thinks he's qualified." She rose to her feet and slammed a hand down on her desk. I don't believe this." Amelia shook her head. "I don't envy you, Minerva. You're being stuck with Fudge's cast-offs, but from my perspective it's rather an interesting thing to watch." "What are you talking about?" McGonagall asked, tossing her hand in the air. "That man is directly responsible for Umbridge's presence at this school. If he hadn't sent her back here, Dennis Creevy wouldn't now be in the hospital wing." Amelia's eyes darkened with sadness. "I know, and I'm sorry for it. Then what is it you find so interesting?" The head of magical law enforcement looked back towards the door Fudge had exited. "I've never seen a man actually destroy his own career before. Hell, at this point, he's hanging himself and doesn't even realize it." Hogwarts, the morning of October 17th. A knock on the door caused the new headmaster of Hogwarts to smile in pleasure. Finally, all his hard work had paid off. "Come," he called loudly. The door opened and Ron Weasley stepped into the office, a covered crystal dish in his hand. "Hello, Headmaster. It's good to see you," Ron Percy Weasley said, nodding. "What brings you to my office, and so early in the morning?" Ron sighed. "I wanted to apologize to you. When I heard that you'd been appointed headmaster, well, let's just say that Mum would have washed my mouth out and leave it at that. But Harry pointed out that if anyone could do a better job than Dumbledore, it would be you. He said you'd be the one to fix what's wrong at Hogwarts." Percy sat back on his chair, shocked. "Harry said that. He did. He moved to the chair and sat down in front of Percy's desk. I have to say, Percy, things have been really odd around here this year. Dumbledore's been trying to get Harry, Hermione, and I due to some really strange things. And we're not the only ones he's asked. That's why none of us have been going to class. We just don't feel safe. Strange." "How so?" Percy asked, intrigued. "Well, you know that Hermione's a powerful witch and few doubt her intelligence. Dumbledore tried to talk both Harry and I into sleeping with her and not using the contraception charm. He kept saying something about not letting all the good blood get away." Ron shook his head. "Seamus, Neville, Dean, Anthony. A lot of blokes received the same orders from Dumbledore, though with different girls. Dean was even asked to do that with Ginny. We can't understand what's going on, and frankly, the girls are scared." "That's barbaric," Percy exclaimed, outraged at the very thought of someone violating a young woman in such a way, especially his baby sister. "I know, but that's not all of it, Percy." He leaned forward. "Dumbledore has been trying to get Harry and I to learn how to cast the unforgivable curses," he said quietly. "What?" Ron nodded. "We've held out as long as we can, but we're sure glad to see you here. You were right. Fudge is smarter than we all gave him credit for. After all, he sent you here to help us." Percy's expression was a cross between arrogance and outrage. "Don't worry, Ron. I'm not going to let anything happen to you, Ginny, or your friends." Ron's tense posture relaxed visibly. "Thank you, brother. I mean, headmaster." "Sorry." Percy shook his head. "It's all right to call me by my given name or brother when we're private like this, Ron. But please address me as headmaster when others are with you." Ron blinked. "Thanks, Percy." Leaning back on his chair, he looked at the covered dish in Ron's hand. "What's that?" Ron looked down. "Oh, this. When we heard that you were going to be made headmaster, the 5th, 6th, and 7th year Gryffindors all pitched in and bought you this. It took a bit of doing to get it here on time, and we weren't sure we'd have enough, but we managed," he said proudly as he placed the dish on the desk. "It's our way of welcoming you." Percy examined the dish, recognizing its quality. "It's beautiful, Ron," he said, somewhat shocked that the students would go to such lengths. "Open it," Ron urged him. Puzzled but curious, Percy did as he asked and smiled at what he found inside. "Saltwater taffy," he said, looking up at Ron. "You remember, you do still like it, don't you?" he asked earnestly. Laughing, Percy plucked a piece of taffy out of the dish. "I do. Please thank the students for me, would you?" When Ron nodded, he popped the taffy into his mouth and began to chew. That his brother remembered his favorite sweet touched him greatly. The brothers spent some time together, reminiscing about their family. Percy had eaten 3 more pieces of taffy and was beginning to act a bit strange. Glancing at the clock on the mantel, Ron stood up and announced that he had best stop taking up the headmaster's time, as this was his first day, and he was sure the students would be gathered in the great hall to welcome him at breakfast. Percy giggled slightly, then stared at his desk oddly. "It's like a rainbow," he said, staring at the grain of the wood. "Do you see it?" he asked. Ron frowned. "Are you all right?" The new headmaster of Hogwarts surged to his feet. "I'm headmaster at Hogwarts." "No, that's not right," Hoggedward. No, Hogfeet. "Yes, that's it. I'm headmaster at Hogfeet School, Wizardcraft and Witchery." He laughed. "Witchery. Witchery." He laughed. "Witchery. Witchery." It glared at Ron. "There will be no snitchery at Hogfeet." "All right." "No snitchery." "Understood, headmaster," Ron said as he backed towards the door. "Breakfast is in a few minutes, and you need to address the students, sir." Percy nodded, then quickly grabbed his head and stared at Ron. "Did you see that? My head nearly flew off. Need to be more careful. On breakfast, did you say? Yes, yes, must address the students." He waved at Ron cheerfully. "Go on then, go address the students." "Not me, Percy. You're the new headmaster, remember?" Though he didn't want to show it, he was becoming a bit alarmed by Percy's behavior. "Right? Knew that? Well then, go on down." "I'll be there shortly, my good man," Percy exclaimed. Leaving the office, Ron dashed down the stairs for the great hall. The taffy had been Hermione's idea, and he had a few questions for the witch. She told him to play suck-up to his brother to put Percy at ease, making him more likely to try the taffy. One didn't need to be a genius to make the connection. Sliding into his spot at the Gryffindor table, he glared at Hermione, who sat across from him. "What did you put in that taffy?" he hissed. "Something I found in one of the books Harry gave me." "It's just a little something to loosen up our new headmaster," she replied. "Did it work? If he gets any looser, he's going to fly apart, Hermione." She laughed. "Then I'd say we're going to experience a rather interesting address this morning." Harry looked between the two of them, and not for the first time was glad to remain clueless. Headmaster Percy Weasley arrived a few minutes later. He walked to the head table with his head down, seeming to be extraordinarily interested in his feat. He approached the headmaster's chair, then looked out at the shining faces of the student body. "What are you all doing here?" he exclaimed, surprised by their presence. "It's breakfast," Minerva hissed. "They're waiting for you to address them so they can eat." He nodded absently, still staring out at the students. "My feet make rainbows when I walk," he suddenly blurted. He cocked his head. "Well, stop staring at me and eat already. You can't be expected to learn if you don't eat a noxious breakfast every morning." "I think the word is nutritious," Minerva said quietly. "Yes, that too," Percy said with a nod. "So, eat already." He punctuated his command by slamming his hand down on the table, causing the flatware to jump. When the food appeared at the tables, Harry shook his head. "Hell, he's been taking lessons from Dumbledore." "No! Hermione's got him pumped full of her wacky taffy." Ron accused. "Same difference," Hermione said with a shrug. Leaning slightly towards the table, Harry looked at Colin Creevey. "How's Dennis?" "He's being released today," Colin said from his seat beside Hermione. "He should be joining us for lunch." "Excellent," Ron cheered. "Definitely a good day," Hermione agreed. "Have his memories returned?" Harry asked, frowning. Colin shook his head. "No, but Madame Pomfrey said that's not unusual. She said something about the mind choosing not to process the trauma or some such. I didn't really understand it all. Mum and Dad understand what she means, though, and warned that just because he doesn't remember now doesn't mean he'll never remember, and that we should be prepared, just in case." Hermione frowned. "What do we tell him if he asks us what happened? Just that he was hurt and that Madame Pomfrey healed him." "If he asks for details, send him to me," Colin said. Harry watched the young man carefully. Something was missing, and he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. "Is there anything else we should be aware of?" Ron asked. "Anything he needs?" Colin sighed. "Well, he has nightmares, but I've already spoken to his dorm mates about that." He ran a hand over his face and shook his head. "Madame Pomfrey says they'll fade with time." Harry closed his eyes as he figured out what was wrong. Colin, usually hyperactively cheerful, had been forced to mature in the last few days. If Dumbledore hadn't left, Umbridge would never have been put in charge. None of this would have happened, Harry thought. Yet another sin to lay at that bastard's feet. "Hermione," Harry asked as he opened his eyes, "how much of that taffy do you have?" "Depends on what you're wanting it for," she said. "Why? Percy could do a lot of damage if he comes back to himself long enough." "Now wait a minute," Ron protested. "My brother may be an arse, but I don't think I like the idea of him being drugged." "He'll be fine, Ron. The drug is mildly addictive." "What?" "Hermione, how could you?" he growled. "Let me finish, Ron." She glared him into silence. "Yes, the drug is mildly addictive, which means he's going to want more. However, when the time comes for Percy to step down as headmaster, we'll simply administer the antidote. He won't be harmed in any way." "Antidote?" Harry asked. "Of course. I'm not going to feed someone an addictive drug without having a way of countering it." "I should have known that," Ron mumbled. "Sorry, Hermione. That being the case, we're going to have to keep feeding it to him," Harry told them. Though Ron wasn't thrilled with the idea, he agreed. Hermione shrugged. "There should be plenty of taffy to keep him out of our hair until Dumbledore gets back from his little jaunt." Yes, Harry murmured. I wonder what the man is up to. I mean, leaving like he did. He had to know Umbridge would be put in charge in his absence. There's more going on here than we know. Well, that's new and different, Ron said sarcastically. Let's face it, we're usually clueless until something jumps out and bites us on the arse. Harry shook his head. I don't like it, but I don't see any way of finding out what's going on. Head up, guys! Seamus called from a few seats away. Looking up, Harry noticed the potions professor stalking towards their house table. Great! Wonder what he wants, Ron grumbled. I think we're about to find out, Hermione said. Pee! Snape snarled as he glided to a stop next to Harry. The other PP professors may let you get away with your little rebellion, but if you think I'll let you go unchecked, think again. I want to know what you and your little friends think you're doing. Ducking the man's spittle, Harry shrugged. And people in hell want ice water. Now, if that's all, I have a lovely day of origami planned. My animal collection is nearly complete. Snape leaned closer, his eyes narrowed in hate. I know that you're the one who cast this blasted spell on me, P. Potter. The headmaster may turn a blind eye to your actions, but I will not. I want it removed now. Harry scowled. I didn't cast anything on you, Professor, especially not something as childish and harmless as a stuttering curse. After what I did to you this summer, I assumed you'd be smart enough to recognize the difference between an immature prank and something more serious. He sighed in discontent. And I had really hoped at least one Auror would have spotted you when you went to replace your wand. I'm really very disappointed in that. When the man snarled, Harry stood up so suddenly, Snape stumbled back a few steps. Look, I told you I didn't cast that stupid spell, and I meant it. And while I'm certainly not going to subject myself to Veritaserum, I'm pretty sure I can find a cure for it. Snape shook his head. And what makes you think you can find a cure when I couldn't? Easy. You don't have access to a library full of old, illegal, and just plain out-of-print books. P.P. Potter, Snape began with a growl. Stuff it, Professor, or I won't waste my time, and you can stutter your way through the rest of your miserable life, however long that may be, Harry snapped, glaring at the man. Now get the hell out of my way. Turning away, Harry left the great hall, muttering to himself. With a final glare at Harry's friends, Snape spun on his heel and left. Ron and Hermione looked at each other for a moment, then bolted from the hall in search of Harry. They found him in the common room, quietly talking to Dobby. Once the elf had disappeared, Harry looked at his friends inquiringly. You're going to help Snape? Hermione blurted. Harry shrugged. Why not? I don't know about you two, but I'm getting tired of carrying a bit of that man around everywhere I go, he said, holding out his robes and cringing. Even though I know my robes are laundered, my skin still crawls at the thought of him spitting on me every time he says my name. Ron grimaced. Yeah, I can see the upside, but why not simply end the spell? Where's the fun in that? Harry asked, smiling. Besides, if I just ended it, he'd know I cast it. This way, if he performs a ritual I found in a book, he'll think he solved his own problem, and we'll be able to enjoy watching him jump through the hoops I've created. Ron shook his head. He's going to be suspicious of any instructions you give him, you know. That's why I'm not going to give him anything. I'm having Dobby copy a bunch of stuff from different books in my library. He'll insert the ritual and deliver the old books to the professor once he's done. What's the ritual? Hermione asked, curious. Harry shrugged. You'll see. Hermione rolled her eyes. I hate it when you do that. At lunch, Dobby reported that the book had been delivered. Looking at the head table, Harry noted Snape's absence and shook his head. It was just too easy. That evening after dinner, Harry faced his housemates in the common room and explained what he'd done. We all knew you put that curse on him, Seamus said. Hell, even Snape knows it. He just can't prove it. True, but today I gave him a cure for his curse, Harry said, and we're all about to find out if he took the bait. How? Parvati asked. Turning, Harry flicked his wand at one wall and sat down on the couch between Ron and Hermione. Well, if he fell for it, the modified monitoring charm that was placed on him will activate as soon as he leaves the castle. He made a mental note to thank Dobby. Yet again, students talked quietly for several minutes before the wall flickered to life. They watched as the professor walked down the steps from the castle and paused at the bottom. He looked around furtively, hitched a small bag up on his shoulder, then turned and walked briskly toward the forest. I've never heard of a spell like this, Hermione murmured. we'll be able to watch him. I asked Dobby for something that would allow us to see what he's doing, Harry said quietly. I have to say, I'm becoming more and more impressed with house elf magic. That makes two of us. So what's he doing, Harry? Ron asked. Trying to break the curse. Ron rolled his eyes. Yeah, I figured that one out on my own. What I want to know is how. Everyone turned to Harry, waiting for the explanation, while Harry watched the images on the wall with narrowed eyes. Snape had just entered the forest. The book said that touching a unicorn would break the curse. It listed the creatures as a panacea. Hermione snorted. That's ridiculous. There's no such thing as a panacea. Snape would disagree, Dean said, grinning. Or maybe it's just that he's desperate enough to try anything. So what's in the bag he's carrying? Neville asked. A picklehorby helm and a field marshal's baton, Harry replied. He shook his head, seeing many blank looks. A really funky-looking helmet and an ornate stick. The ritual is, once the unicorn is found, Snape needs to strip naked, put on the helmet, hold the stick and touch the pretty horsey. Much gagging and retching followed the explanation. Wait a minute, Harry, Lavender said some time later. So Snape thinks that he simply has to touch a unicorn. And he'll be cured! When he nodded, she turned back to the screen, her eyes wide. Oh, that's just not right. This falls under the subject of things you really don't want to know about your professors. What are you nattering on about? Ginny asked. Didn't you guys get it? Lavender asked, looking first at Ginny, then at her other housemates. Snape's a virgin. Get real, Lavender. Snape, a virgin. Seema scoffed. She has a point, Hermione told them, watching the professor as he prowled the forest. Snape knows as well as we do that a unicorn would never let a non-virgin near it. The fact that he's out there, apparently looking for one to molest, means he is a virgin. Ron blanched. As if talking about Snape's virginity weren't bad enough, you have to go and use the word molest. Look! Colin exclaimed. He's found something. Eyes snapped back to the wall, and the students watched Snape dance to one side, narrowly avoiding an arrow. Harry grinned. Looks like he found a horse. Half of one, anyway. His eyes narrowed as a centaur stepped out and faced Snape. I think the professor is in for a bad night. That's Bane. The fight lasted longer than most thought it would, and the students' voices grew as they cheered or shouted advice to the combatants. Harry wasn't sure who they were cheering for, but his money was on Snape, not because he thought the centaur was a pushover, but because if Snape lost, the game would be over. Bane was quick with his bow, leaving Snape little choice but to dodge or swat arrows away with spells. Had another member of Bane's herd been with him, the professor would have been in worse shape. As it was, he took an arrow to the leg before he managed to bring Bane down with a stunner. As Snape began to limp back towards the castle, Ron glanced at Harry, then Hermione, and groaned. I know that look, Hermione, and I'm almost afraid to ask what's going through that fuzzy little head of yours. My head is not fuzzy, she snapped. Harry snorted and opened his mouth to refute that, only to have Ron slap his hand over his mouth. Yeah, I know what you're going to say, mate, but shut it. You get her started on the topic of her hair, and we'll never hear the end of it, he muttered. Removing his hand, he shook his head. Well, what is going through that brilliant mind of yours? He asked her. Oh, I was just wondering what Rita Skeeter's up to these days, she said, her eyes bright.